Hello, everyone. Welcome to 345 Tech Talks, the podcast with me, Andrew. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Danny. And Danny hasn't been on the podcast for a few months. I mean, I know we've been a bit slow at getting podcasts done, but welcome back, Danny. Today, we're going to talk about Agile project management, Agile projects, Agile commercials, how you manage these things, and how to look at things that go wrong. So let's just let's dive straight in. So
let's do that. But firstly, thanks for having me back on. Good to get back onto a podcast and talk about some of this stuff. So I think, like you said, let's get straight into it. My first real question is there anyone that isn't doing Agile projects at the minute, or is not using the Agile methodology to run their projects? I think that'd be my first question to you.
So that's a really interesting one, actually, and I mean, Agile has become kind of all pervasive. So there's a couple of ways to answer this. I mean, there are some projects that are so small that they don't really fit that kind of Agile model.
That's a good point.
That if you're going to just do, if actually you're coming to do a piece of work and it's just write this widget, that doesn't necessarily fit a kind of let's spin up an Agile project to write a widget for 2 days. So there is a sort of almost a critical mass of a size of a project that needs to be done for Agile, because realistically speaking, because if it's too small, then the whole the way you sort of structure a project and build a backlog, organize, maybe create sprints and work through that, there's a certain, if you're not doing a certain number of sprints or whatever, I don't know what the minimum number might be, but I mean, normally when we kick off a project, we have a sprint 0 when we get the foundations in. And then if you're not doing at least 3 sprints, and I mean, typically we do 2-week ones, but if you're not doing at least 3 of those, maybe at least 6, really, it's like, you question is it big enough? So there's that side of it. There's the small side of it, but then there's also the really, really large kind of engineering scale things. So if you were building software for a satellite, you might not do that as an Agile project either, because it's so it's so kind of predefined and needs to be exact. You're not just sort of, you're not elaborating as you go along. You've kind of, there's a serious kind of systems engineering process goes on with some of those things, but most things in the middle these days are probably Agile.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting that you said that about minimum size of project, and I guess it probably leads quite nicely into my next question, which would then sort of work out, well, would you need a minimum size team to run an Agile project, or is there a minimum number of people that would allow that to happen?
Oh, that's a good one. So let's talk about this in a couple of ways. Firstly, I mean, I don't think there is any. I don't think there's any sort of really defined minimum. As in, I don't think you can open up a textbook and someone would say the minimum is 4 or the minimum is 3. I mean, certainly I've worked on Agile projects that have been quite successful with 3 people. I mean, even 2 people you could probably do 6. You could probably work in an Agile way with 2 people. If it's just yourself, what point does that just become you being a consultant rather than running a project? So there is a kind of a critical mass, and I'd probably, realistically probably put it at about 3 people. But at the same time, there's a point at which you get too big a team, and it probably needs to split. So I mean, they talk about like the 2 pizzas or whatever it is, or so so realistically, if you get somewhere north of about 8, then probably you should be looking at splitting that into 2 smaller teams. So if you get more than 8, if you're going to go to 9, you probably want to split into a 5 and a 4, or something like that, because you start to lose the cohesiveness as a team and the real kind of close communication and the collaboration that you get with the team. So there's definitely a minimum, but there's also kind of a maximum, and the sweet spot is often in the 4 to 6 kind of area.
Yeah. And I guess with the the 3-4-5 technology way of working, those teams need to be working together potentially on multiple projects going on through the year. So that makes
yeah. I mean that's certainly something we focus on, and we focus on the fact that teams don't just happen. Teams have to be built, and it's and if you've got a really good team that's functioning, it makes more sense that when they come to the end of a project to give them more work but keep them together as a highly functioning team than it is to just disband them and then try and reform another team to do something else. It makes much more sense to sort of say, if you've got a really cohesive, highly functioning team, then why don't you give more work to the same team? It's a bit like you see it in sports where let's say a football club will take a manager, but they actually bring all their whole backroom staff with them. They'll bring they'll bring a whole team, because actually you're not just hiring the one person, you're hiring the other people around them that all together act, and they know what they're doing, and they know how each other works, and actually that's a much more effective way of doing that than just to sort of say, well, let's just drag a bunch of random people together and hope that they're a team. So there's definitely that aspect of it.
So I guess from here on in there, we've got our, we've chosen that we're going to use Agile. We've got our team size. Now, one big question I think from a management perspective is how we structure the commercials around that, and using Agile within a commercial, within a contract commercially. So I'd like to hear your thoughts, if you have any, around that, and maybe some experiences, good or bad.
Well, okay. So here's the thing. One of the principles of Agile is that you accommodate change. That as you go through a project, you learn more about the problem space, and therefore later on in the project, you know a lot more, and then at the start of it, you know a lot less. And so, by definition, what you might think is the best scope for your solution at the start might not be what you think is the best in the middle or at the end, because all the time you're learning. And so commercial arrangements where you try to sort of say right at the start, here's the things that I want, we can run into a lot of problems with those, because what invariably happens is you say, oh, I want this feature, I want feature X, I want people to press a button that does this, and then you build it, and then they say, oh, but actually, if you press the button, I want it to ring a bell and do something else as well. You can, and that's the whole point of learning, because as you learn, you kind of realize that actually what you specified at the start isn't exactly right. But if you've kind of if you've got a very rigid kind of, here's my wish list at the start, and this is how much I'm going to pay for it, then when you sort of say, actually, my project's going to be really better if that button does something else as well, and you kind of say, well, it's not in the contract. And that's where and that's where things get difficult, is that if you've got an overly prescriptive contract that particularly wants a set of things at a set time, that can lead to a lot of problems, because then as soon as you say that, as well, that's a contract change and that's going to cost you more, and then people say, oh, but I'm already paying this, and then that's where it can go really wrong. But the other way round for that is that you kind of say, well, I've got this list of things, I don't quite know how long it's going to take me to build them, and then you want these things by these particular dates. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to build in a load of contingency into this, which, Mr. Customer, you're going to have to pay for, in order to account for any of these additional things that you want and all that sort of thing. And so if you try to fix, so if you try to fix scope, fix price stuff, and that is underneath it all, it's agile, the chances are you're going to overpay compared to just paying for the team, because you've got built in so much contingency that it's going to cost a lot more. Whereas the most effective way is to, on a commercial basis, to say, I'm going to pay for a team, and as that team goes forwards and learns, we can tweak what they do, and I'm going to pay for them to do the best thing at the time. So, and then so generally speaking, what always ends up being the most efficient for the customer price wise is to just pay for the team on a kind of a time materials basis. But then you kind of say, well, hang on a moment, I'm taking all the customer might say, well, I'm taking all the risk here. What's going on?
Yeah.
To which there's a couple of answers there. One of them is that well, if you fix price it, you're still paying for all the risk. It's just you're paying for it up front. And so if the risks go bad, you've kind of paid for it and you've covered it. But if the risks don't go bad, then if you fix price it, you've paid for that anyway. So there is an element to which that's a bit of a false kind of argument. But also, what we also tend to do with agile projects is we have what we call inspection points. So you might sort of say, well, okay, I'm going to run 4 sprints, and then we'll have a point there at which you can say, yeah, Mr. Customer, if you're not happy, you can sort of say, well, let's wrap up there, no penalties. And then, but if you continue, then you do like maybe another 4 sprints, and then say, okay, well, this is the next inspection point. Are we still happy? Do we want to continue, or do we want to finish? And that means that you don't get locked into some massively long-term contract that you can't get out of. So there is an element there of, so for us as the software team, we've got to keep delivering value, or the project will end.
Yeah, so it puts a bit of pressure on us as well, rather than like you said there about once you've signed a fixed price over a fixed term. Okay, it doesn't mean that you're going to work any less harder, but also there's that ability to to grow with a client as well. I think is a big part of that. It allows us to sort of keep moving forward with a client and what they want to do, because everybody's got a project going on at some point, and we'd like to be a part of that if we can. We need to prove ourselves, and that goes alongside that. I think that nicely moves into things like measurable and reporting function on there. You said about the inspection points and how we measure our projects, how we've done it, and how we do it. So I'd be really interested to know.
Oh, that's a big topic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's because I think I also think with this, so I'd be really interested to know your thoughts, because different clients like things in different ways in terms of how things are measured. And so, again, we're almost being very agile on that basis to say we're quite happy to do that in various different ways to sort of suit the stakeholder, if you like. But it'd be interesting if there's some experience around what we've done in the past.
So, there's so many threads on this. What's the best one to start? So let's go back to Agile Manifesto, and there's because you've got the Agile Manifesto, and then you've got the kind of the supporting things that sit behind it. Well, hang on a minute, my dog's just come to say hello. Right, you go down there. Right. So, and one of kind of the supporting tenets of Agile is that the primary measure of progress is working software. And so one of the things that is always critical is to treat working software as your primary measure of progress. And the way we typically do this is either we're doing continuous delivery, so that the software is being rolled out continuously, or at the end of every sprint, we actually demonstrate what we've built. And and that gets maybe shipped into a testing environment, and you know, and the customer can go and look in that. But you know, there is nowhere to hide. Then you've either built this stuff or you haven't. It can be difficult on some projects where you've got like loads of foundational stuff to do first, and you don't see anything working until you get a certain amount down the line. But typically speaking, you know, being able to sort of ship, you know, either every week or every 2 weeks to ship a new version of your app to the customer and say, there is the latest version, go and try it out. Or here's the latest version, I will demonstrate it to you. That is, there's no substitute for that. The other things that are quite, you know, but then you can also get yourself into, but then there's what the reporting externally and internally are, I suppose, two different questions. That if we're running a project for a customer, what do we need to report to them? And then there's the, you know, as the management or whatever of that's sitting over this project team, what can I look at to know that team is functioning properly? So those are kind of a couple of different questions. So one of them, so one of the things that just looking at from the management of a team, I mean, some of the things I look at are, you know, typical thing, you look at velocity. So if we're working in user stories and those stories have got a certain number of story points associated with them, which is a scale, which for the uninitiated is a measure of how big they are. We can look at how many, you know, basically how many things we're getting ticked off our list every week or every 2 weeks, every sprint or whatever. And we call that velocity. So let's say, for example, each user story has 5 points, and we do, you know, 5 user stories a week. Then we've got a velocity of 25 points a week, which kind of makes you think that if you then look at, well, how fast will we go next week? Well, next week we should go 25 as well, or maybe 26, because over time you should actually, as the team gets more skilled and the design is better known, and your patterns have been established, you should increase velocity over time. But so velocity shouldn't go down; it should always either stay the same or go up. So velocity is one thing to look at, and that's both something that is good for a customer to know, but also for management to know, because you can kind of say, well, you know, if you can then estimate your backlog and kind of think, well, how long is it going to take me to get through my backlog? Well, if I'm doing 25 points a week and my backlog is 400 points, then okay, I've got around about 16 weeks, give or take. But at least you can get a reasonable estimate of how long it takes you to get through a backlog. So velocity is a key thing. But one of the things that particularly on a personal level, I look at with the devs on the team would just be, you know, how many tasks they get through, how many commits are they making, you know, because developers should be committing their code and pushing that every day. So they shouldn't be left with a load of code on their machine, so that if their machine broke, you'd lose days and days of work. They should be pushing their code, committing it and pushing it at least once a day, preferably more often. So one thing to look, you know, just to see that things is just to make sure things are happening, is just how many commits am I getting from each of my developers every day. And that's a useful thing to know. And then we look at things like burn down. So you know, when we're in a sprint and we've bitten off a certain chunk of work, we can, you know, we can plot that on a chart to say, yeah, okay, at the start of the sprint you've got this much work to do, and over the sprint that kind of work goes down. That's burned down, and at the end of it you should have 0 work left to do in that sprint. So so the concept of burn down, either in a sprint or through a backlog, is a very useful thing to plot, because because we can see that we're getting through work. And finally, when we are actually rolling that out and people are commenting on it, we can look at things like defect rate as well, because if people are raising bugs very quickly or very frequently, then that's bad, right? And so there's a whole load of stuff around defects that you can measure on report on as well. So in terms of how you are doing in terms of your project, you know, test coverage, how many of the features of the overall thing have I tested and passed test, or have I tested is a good measure, because that's the kind of how much of it's done is how many, what's my test coverage, and then what's my defect rate. Those are really key measures. And obviously, if your defect rate's going up and your test, then that's bad. If your defect rate's coming down and your test coverage is going up, that's good. So we look at some of those things.
Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you for that. I think you mentioned it there earlier about the velocity. It's a really good measure. So I guess that sort of leads me into how we get the sort of warning signs that the project might not be working or going as well as we think. And one of those things might be the velocity numbers potentially, or like you said there about code being pushed out by the team. Is that happening or not happening? And then also you mentioned there around the bugs and defects as well, and if there's too many of those coming through. So I guess these are warning signs. But is there other warning signs that you find within a project that could be sort of scoped out?
There are, and I'll tell you what one of them is that if you're doing sprints properly, at the start of the sprint you say this is the work we're going to do, and then you do that work. A real kind of alarm bell is if people are either working on stuff that wasn't, if anyone is working on stuff in that sprint that wasn't defined at the start of it, that's bad. I mean, it's one thing to sort of say you're working on a feature and actually you understand a bit more about it, so you've created a couple of tasks under that feature. That's okay. That's okay, because the feature itself shouldn't have particularly changed. But if people are working on stuff that isn't in your sprint backlog, that is a real kind of alarm bell, because it's like, what on earth is going on? That violates some of the principles that you're supposed to be working to. And what you'll find, if that's happening, that can be a cause of velocities dropping, because you can because if your team's working just as hard but your reported velocity is dropping, it probably means that they are working on other stuff that wasn't planned. And there's I think the term for it is dark matter. It's like, how much dark matter is there in your project? It's like, because that's the sort of stuff that no one could see beforehand, but it still sort of sucks effort. And so if you're having problems, then that's often a cause of that it's like people are working on stuff that wasn't visible at the start.
Could that also be seen as a potential communication issue between the team? And we go back to almost the beginning around how a team works together.
So there's often it's not necessarily between the team, but there can be a lot of issues here that are rooted in communication between team and the customer.
Sure.
Or the team and because one of the things that because when we let's just take a brief detour on the definition of ready. So when we put stuff on a sprint backlog, it should only be allowed to go on a sprint backlog if it meets our definition of ready. And our definition of ready means that it's ready to be worked on. And that means that we know enough about it that we can start working on it. Because if you put something on your backlog and you sort of say, it says build widget X, and you say, well, what does that actually involve? And if so, I don't know, but here it is, widget X, we've got to build it. Like for us, we'd say no, that's not ready, because unless you can properly define what that is, in particular even up to what the acceptance criteria are, because that's where you can be like, well, we'll build what we think widget X is. Well, hang on a minute, dog's hassling me again. Here she is. There you go. This is Lottie, everyone. Just come say hello. You can't bear me talking to someone else.
Or thousands of others through podcasts.
Or thousands of others. So if you don't meet the definition of ready, then you shouldn't be working on it, because that's where people sort of say, oh, just build widget X, and you sort of say, well, here it is, and they say, oh, I don't like the color, change that, change the color in widget X. Oh, can it just do that as well? And then you end up with this kind of open-ended thing of you're just constantly dribbling away effort because you didn't know what it was you were building in the first place. And so there needs to be a certain amount of discipline source. There needs to be that sort of quality gate at the start to say, if this doesn't meet the definition of ready, I'm not even going to start on it, because otherwise that's going to end up causing loads of dark matter to appear in my project. But then the other side of that is definition of done as well, because because we should always say, well, when is a task finished? Because we used to have the whole works on my machine, therefore it's done. But where does it have to work for it to be done? I mean, is that when it's pushed out into production? Is that when it's in a test environment? Is that when it's and if it's a test environment, which test environment? Each team, depending on what it's going to be, if you're in a real continuous delivery mode where you're shipping features literally every day, then you might mark it as done when it's actually being shipped. If you're shipping features less frequently, or you might say, okay, it's got to be in a staging environment or something like for it, and it's got to have passed test in a staging environment for it to be done. But however you define it, you need to have a definition of done as well, so that you can say, okay, this is done. I've done it according to the definition. I've done the acceptance criteria according to the definition of ready, and now it's in a staging environment. It's passed test. It's done, and I can, and then. Because the thing then is that once that's done, if anyone says, oh, I don't like that feature, can you just change the color on the button? That then becomes a new piece of work which has to go into planning, rather than just reopening that and continually having this dribble of change. It's just like, okay, that's fine. If we find that we've shipped that according to what it does, and the definition is now changed because we've learnt more, then that's okay. But that then goes back onto the backlog, gets planned in, goes another sprint, and that sort of thing. And having the and so you need the discipline to do that, because if you don't, you get all these other warning signs that come up. All these other tasks that keep getting created mid sprint, and velocity falling because you've been because you can't finish it. You can't finish a feature because it just keeps on changing. The more you do it, the more it changes. So those are kind of some of the warning signs I'd look at.
Okay. I suppose with everything that's happened over the past couple of years, with the whole COVID scenario and situation, it's made things from a collaboration perspective a lot tougher. So you're not sort of in your, we're not set up in an office as a team. So although 345 Technology have our office and have our office space, and we try and collaborate as much as we possibly can in there, that stick with the rules and things like that. But has there been any real sort of change, and does it make it a little bit more difficult having a remote working environment?
So here's an interesting. I mean, we've done kind of hybrid working for a long time, but just about all of our project teams are now working almost fully remote. And over the last couple of years, that's the first time we've really done that. It was the first time we've really been fully remote, because what we used to do is we used to often get everyone into the same office at the start of a project for maybe a couple of weeks, so that everyone was, as we're breaking the problem down and getting to a common understanding of it, we're all there in the same place, sharing whiteboard sessions, talking about it over the coffee machine, all that sort of stuff. And then we often have like maybe 1 or 2 days a week in the office, or whatever it is, some days remotely, and we'd have that kind of hybrid working. And then often when you come to the end of a project, it's getting to a really critical phase and you're just about to ship it and it's got to be just right. Often you get everyone back in then for those, for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it takes before you ship, just so that everyone's there, everyone's literally hearing the same conversation in real time. And that sort of thing. And that's kind of how we used to do things. And then obviously going to fully remote, one of the things that is comes with this is we need to actually put a lot of effort into communication. And you kind of think, well, we're quite good at communication, but you almost have to make it a conscious effort on communication. You can't assume that it happens by osmosis. That if you've got 4 of you in a fairly small room and everyone can hear every word that's being said, you can kind of assume that people kind of know what's going on because we're all in the same room. And so there's that whole thing of communication becomes a real conscious thing that you have to drive, or almost sometimes it almost feels forced, but you have to really drive communication because you can't just assume that it's happening. So that's the real thing. The other thing is that with the best will in the world, when people are together in the old-fashioned office setting, just kind of think it's some of the teams that I've been in the past. You'd be working, then you'd maybe go to lunch together, and then you'd be going for a coffee together, and you get a lot. You naturally build a lot of cohesiveness of your team like that. Now, when you actually go to remote, no one's having a coffee together. They're often, you might be having, you might be having plenty of meetings to discuss a particular problem or to discuss the work, but finding that time for everyone to just feel like they're bonding as a team and they know each other and they trust each other and that sort of thing. So that's the other side of it. I think we need to, also put some effort into is how we actually get that kind of, that kind of team bonding together. So because again, going back to olden days of before 2020, you kind of again just sort of took it for granted that if people were together and working together, then that would sort of happen. And okay, you might need, as a manager, you might need to sort out the odd personality clash or something like that. But typically speaking, just the fact that people are together would engender a certain amount of bonding. Now you can't rely on that without putting directed effort towards it, is what I say. So that's kind of how I'd look at that one.
Yeah, that's really good. It's really interesting. I suppose it leads into sort of assessing, contribution to even, from team members. Obviously being remote. I guess.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about that before.
Touched on it,
yeah. We touched on that with things like velocity and measuring what how many commits people have done and all that sort of thing. But there's also there's also an intangible part of teamwork as well, in that if actually you don't get through masses of work, but you enable lots of other people to do masses of work by coaching them or helping them overcome their issues or that sort of thing. There's those are still really important contributions. Not everyone contributes in a team in the same way. Some people are mentoring junior people to do stuff. Some people are just a technical whiz kid that will go and just do huge quantities of things. But some people need to be the one that's steady and just making sure it all hangs together.
You touched on it earlier around sports teams, and it almost works the same way again. You might not have, if you looked at a football team, for example, the star player that's the one scoring all the goals, but not necessarily.
But if no one passes to them.
And that's supporting the backroom staff, like you say. If he's not getting his massages or her massages and things like that, I think it's a team thing. And like you say, the enablers are very, very important.
And some of those things are like I say, the stuff that's easy to measure. How many lines of code have I written, or something like that? That's easy to measure. But there's some of those softer things that are really important but harder to measure, and I think that's where again you have to direct effort into that, because you can't just measure that stuff like that and expect it to be right. You've actually got to get to know people and see what they're doing and be talking to them and what and so and again it's a lot harder when you're all in the same room. Who's spent half a day pair programming with someone to get them over a blockage. If they're working at home, it's like, well, hey, what have you done today? Can't see anything from you yet.
Yeah.
It's these things become, it's almost like what I'm getting at is that some of the really valuable but less measurable behaviors, it can be easy to overlook them when you're remote.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's and one of the challenges is to make sure that people still do the right thing even when no one can see it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. I think that was a really interesting conversation, something that we've not spoken about in the past. So I felt that was really valuable, and hopefully the people that listen will find that valuable. Agile is a word that's being thrown around quite a lot, isn't it? So
and it's been the de facto thing for a long time, but funnily enough, people are still getting to grips with what it actually is. So yeah, we're all still learning. I mean, I've been doing Agile since I think my first Agile project was probably in about 2002.
okay.
I'm still learning how to do it better. So it's
There we go.
there we go. Anyway, thanks everyone. Thanks for listening. I've been Andrew. This has been Danny. We've been on the 345 Tech Talk podcast. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.